Welcome to our second lecture in our History of Christian Thought on the Classical World. This one is the Athenian philosophers, the big two, Plato and Aristotle. Alfred North Whitehead said that most of Western civilization are footnotes to Plato and Aristotle, and they will provide much of the foundation for our understanding of the classical world, the Christian world, the medieval world, even through the modern world. So in a sense, this is our first main meaty lecture, and we will be discussing these issues raised by these two thinkers in pretty much every single lecture from here on out. Now here's what I want the student to get out of a lecture like this. First, I want the student to be able to define metaphysics. What is it? How do Plato and Aristotle exemplify it? What are their metaphysical opinions? Okay. Secondly, I want the student to be able to compare and contrast rationalist and empiricist explanations for the world around us, explanations for reality. And we'll see how Plato and Aristotle exemplify those ideas or those approaches. And finally, I want the student to examine different ways in which the classical world ordered their lives. We already talked about the Homeric school and the Milesian school. I want the student to be able to continue that discussion and see how Plato and Aristotle affected how a person in that period ordered their life. Okay? I usually start out these lectures with a discussion, and it is my opportunity as a teacher to frustrate the student by asking him or her this question: what is the essence of chair? What makes a chair a chair? I take great delight in watching them fumble around and try and give me an answer, and then I get to shoot every one of those answers down. For example, I get a lot of, well, it has 4 legs and you can sit on it. To which I respond, well, so does a horse. Doesn't make a horse a chair, okay? Oh, it's something that is intended to be sat upon. Couches are intended to be sat upon. Stools are intended to be sat upon. Bicycle seats are intended to be sat upon. That does not make them a chair. And then the intelligent yet snarky student will come up with, well, it's a chair because we call it a chair. Okay, but does that mean we can call anything a chair? If so, I can call you a chair and sit on you, and that's when the students become very uncomfortable. Well, if we're calling it a chair, what about it has earned it the right to be called a chair? Well, this goes on. I keep them dangling for 15 or 20 minutes or so until they get really mad at me. This is my way of introducing Plato and Aristotle. What I'm not trying to do with the students, I'm not trying to get them to come up with any particular answer as to what makes a chair a chair. But with Plato and Aristotle, I can introduce 2 methods for answering that question. Where does one go to find the essence of chair? Plato would have one answer, Aristotle a very different, actually opposing answer. So then we start talking about Plato. Plato was a philosopher in the 5th century. He was a student of Socrates and recorded much of what Socrates said and thought and did. Although it is hard to figure out where Socrates ends and Plato begins, we don't necessarily have access to that information. That's fine. Plato started a school. He gathered a group of learners called the Academy. That's why a lot of our schools today are called the such and such Academy. And Plato had a very clear and distinct answer to what makes a chair a chair. He had a very clear metaphysical opinion. He believed reality is based in the world of forms, the world of ideas. Now, we've already talked about a couple of other philosophers that have had metaphysical opinions. Many in the Milesian school who were materialists thought that the world was made of something. So they thought the world was organized by water or by Empyrean stuff or by fire. The Pythagoreans thought that the world was ordered by numbers. And these are their attempts to explain the nature of reality, to explain the world around us. A Malaysian might look at a chair and say, well, that is a particular configuration of water, of substance, whereas a Pythagorean would try and find some mathematical formula that makes a chair a chair. Plato had a very creative way of getting at this question, and it was in some ways very different than what came before him, although it wasn't completely different. But it was unique enough for him to stand out in history as one of our more prominent thinkers. In his book, The Republic, he came up with a story of a cave and people chained in a cave. Today we call it the parable of the cave or the allegory of the cave. There is a great video where I think it's Orson Welles reads this section of The Republic while it is animated for you. It's a little outdated now, but it's very accurate and very helpful. I'm going to allow for a second now for you to pause this video, go to the website, and watch the other one. It's less than 10 minutes long, but it's much more effective than if I would just describe everything. So why don't you go ahead and do that now? All right, I assume that you have seen the video by now. Let me try and summarize it and clarify what Plato is communicating here. All of us, people on this earth, we are the prisoners. We are the ones chained in the cave. And the only thing that we get to see is the shadows, the objects from the outside world cast upon the back of the cave. They are held in front of a fire, and we get to see their shadow. Now, this actually is very helpful in thinking about a chair and why there are several chairs that look so different, but yet we call them chairs. Like if someone were to parade a chair in front of the fire, we would see the shadow. It would be a dynamic image, always changing. But probably clear enough for us to say, hey, that looks like a chair, even though it gives us variations of what the ideal form is. So that's why 5 different looking things we can all recognize as a chair. Okay? But the shadows on the wall, that's not reality. They are reflections of reality or shadows of reality, but it's not reality. And in Plato's story, this one prisoner is able to leave the cave, to escape the cave, and is blinded by the sun. And it takes him a while to adjust to what he's seeing. And when his eyes finally do adjust, he can see the ideal chair. He can see the essence of chair. He can see that one chair in this world of ideas, the world of forms, sometimes referred to as the heavenly reality, the outside world. He can see what makes a chair a chair. We cannot. We're still stuck in the cave. And he can see things as they actually are. And he comes back into the cave and tries to tell people about it. And they are very resistant to it. So resistant that they end up killing him, okay? It's a wonderfully captivating story, and for our purposes tells us a couple of things. Number one, it shows us that according to Plato, reality is found not in this world, but in the world of ideas, the world of forms, a heavenly reality, although Plato never used that term to the best of my knowledge. So if we want to figure out what makes a chair, we don't go to the chair. We don't observe the chair. We actually turn inward and we think about the idea of chair. And that is how we recognize a chair. That's how we create chairs and things like that. Well, if reality is found in this ideal world, it is not you don't access it through your senses, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, your nose, what have you. You access it through your reason, okay? And Plato was building upon the Pythagorean school. Plato was building upon this tradition that did not look to the outside world for the nature of reality, but looked to numbers, looked to ideas. So in that, Plato's not wholly original, but the way in which Plato articulated this is very original and was very helpful to a lot of people. That's why we still talk about him today. We'll discuss this more in depth later, but Another group of people to which this was helpful were Christians. It is amazing at how close Plato came to how we articulate our faith. A heavenly reality, a person who is sent down to this world to tell us the truth, and we end up killing him for it. There is no evidence that Plato was a Christian. Justin Martyr, a very early Christian apologist, looked at how close Plato came through general revelation, through common grace, and was amazed by it. So much so that he speculated that Plato must have run into some Hebrew thinkers, some Jewish thinkers in his day on a visit to Alexandria or wherever, because these things just sound too similar. Well, I don't think, as Christians, I don't think we need to develop that story, that historical event, in order to understand why the Christian message and Plato's thought has resonance. We believe that God has made us in his image, and God has impressed the law upon our hearts, and has given common grace to everyone that allows us to think rationally. The Bible says the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. There's no spiritual requirement for doing math, so we all have to share some sort of reasoning ability. And according to Justin Martyr, Plato came closer to who God is and who Jesus is well before Jesus of any non-Christian out there. And we can debate that, but I think it is very interesting when you look at when you compare Plato's thought with Christian thought, and that's one of the reasons why Christian thought has made such extensive use of Platonic thought through the years. Even so much then in the book of Hebrews, the author at a couple of different places refers to the Old Testament sacrifices as shadows of the reality, which is Christ, and drawing language very similar to Plato's Republic. I don't believe that means that the author of Hebrews was getting truth from Plato's Republic, but he was at least articulating the Christian message within a Platonic framework that his listeners would have understood. So I think Plato is a great illustration of how one might look at the world around us, a rationalist methodology for understanding what a chair is. And I think Plato is also very helpful in looking at how people have articulated the Christian message throughout the centuries, and we will look at those particular instances as we go through this course. Okay. Now, Plato had a very capable student, a guy named Aristotle. However, when Aristotle approached these questions of the nature of reality, why things are the way they are, why things act the way they act, Aristotle actually had very different opinions on that, actually contrary opinions to a lot of things. His approach was so different, he could not be a teacher in the academy. Aristotle had to form his own school, gather his own group of students, and he called that the Lyceum. One of those students was Alexander the Great, that took Aristotelian thought and Greek culture and kind of spread that throughout the known world. Let's begin by talking about Aristotle's Metaphysics. Aristotle had a book, Posterior Analytics, which explains his approach to the nature of reality. And Aristotle came up with something called the 10 categories. If you want to know what makes a chair, we have to define it by 10 categories. Substance, quantity, qualification, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and affection. Now, I just read those off because I'm going to summarize it in two major categories, substance and form. Okay? For instance, a column, when you look at a column, it's made out of stone. That's its substance. But you can make bridges out of stone. You can make chairs out of stone. You can make a lot of things out of stone. So what makes it a column? Well, not only that it's made out of stone, but it is in the form of a column. Apply this to a chair. What's a chair made out of? Let's just say wood. Okay, that's its substance, and it comes in the form of a chair. Now, that doesn't seem like it gets us any closer to solving this question of what makes a chair a chair. However, it does highlight a new methodology. According to Aristotle, if you want to know what makes a chair, you don't turn inward and think about the ideal chair. You observe a chair. Because Aristotle thought that the essence of chair is found somewhere in the object. And you use your senses, your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, your fingers, in order to observe its characteristics, and therefore that allows you to identify its essence, identify its what makes it real, in what way is it real, and such. So we have these two approaches to metaphysics. We have the Platonic approach, which is a rationalist approach, saying if you want to know what makes something the way it is, if you want to know the essence of something, you have to use your reason, you have to use your mind. You could theoretically be deaf and blind and still be able to contemplate the nature of a chair. This is very similar to the Pythagoreans in our pre-Socratic era. Aristotle did just the opposite. He goes, no, if you want to see what makes a chair, you have to observe it. You have to use your senses. The essence is in there somewhere. It's what we call an empiricist methodology. It focuses on the material aspect of it, which is very much in line with the Milesian school, trying to find the substance of something. Aristotle just kind of kicked that up a notch and say, well, no, it's not just about the substance, it's about substance and form. All these other characteristics, relation, place, time, position, so on and so forth. So that is a very brief outline of the general difference between Plato and Aristotle. A couple more notes on Aristotle, not because I think it will help us understand this era better, but these are issues that were brought up in the history of Christian thought that different thinkers were pushing against, that we should understand where they came from. Aristotle's, I guess, a materialist, or at least empiricist method of understanding the universe led him to describe the universe around us and why it moves. Right? Aristotle thought that the world was divided into two spheres. There is the unchanging sphere, okay? The moon in fixed orbits, the heavenly being outer space for our purposes. They would refer to it as the heavens, as we sometimes do, but it can get confusing when we talk about the Platonic heavenly reality. These are two separate things. Aristotle believed in the unchanging sphere, the fixed orbits of the moon and planets. They move in perfect circles, okay? And you talked about the changing sphere, and that's everything inside the orbit of the moon. And it's made up of different stuff that changes. You have air, you have fire, you have earth, you have water. And this is always changing, always moving. Now you have these four elements in the changing sphere. And this explains Aristotle's theory of motion. Aristotle believed that when something moves, he didn't use gravity or inertia or anything like that to explain it. That comes later on. Aristotle said it has to do with its substance, in keeping with his methodology. That the reason why fire seems to go up is because it wants to be with like elements, the air. That's why fire always rises. The reason why water falls in waterfalls and streams and pouring it out of a pitcher is because water wants to be with a like substance, other water and earth, which is more similar to water than it is to air or to fire. So the reason why something does X is because it wants to do X. It has some sort of drive. It is drawn. And that's why, according to Aristotle, if you have a small object and a large object and you drop them, the large object, according to Aristotle, will fall faster because there's more of it. It has a greater desire, so to speak, of being reunited with the rest of the earth than the smaller object that obviously has less desire. This is not really an explanation. It can't explain the motion of a cannonball or a curveball in baseball, especially. And it's Galileo that would later correct this theory. But it's important to see how Aristotle used his metaphysical stance, this empiricist substantive or materialist position to explain everything else in the world, how things move. Okay, and that is incredibly important. And when Galileo tried to change that, there was a lot of people that were not on board with it. Why? Because Aristotle himself told us otherwise. So we will explore how these different methodologies affects the history of thought as we go forward. But before we do, I want to take a brief moment to discuss how these metaphysical opinions impacted how Greek people organized their lives. So Greek culture. First, we have Greek history. We've already talked about the three major periods: the Archaic or the Homeric period. Plato and Aristotle live within the Hellenic period, the golden age of Greece. And then afterwards, Alexander the Great launches the Hellenistic period. During this Hellenic period, we have a number of wars, a number of historians writing about those wars. Herodotus writing about the Greco-Persian Wars, Thucydides writing about the Peloponnesian Wars. And again, these historians bring up this concept of arete. So even though we have some changes in how the intellectual landscape functions, we don't completely sever that from the period of time that came before it. Arete, this idea that someone should have an excellence and someone should model themselves after these excellencies, are still there, but notice that they are found in histories, not necessarily in mythologies. Okay, we talked artistically about Kouros and boy and Kore girl, these idealistic representations of the human body. The pendulum is swinging from a hardcore idealism towards more of a realism. The influence of Aristotle is being seen in how one portrays art and how one portrays arete, history and not myth, realism versus idealism. And artistically speaking, one of the examples that we discuss is Critias boy. Notice it's still the human as the subject, but if you look at how this human is represented, there is a lot more correspondence to how a human body looks, the proportions of the human body, how the human body moves. This is another way to portray an idea. That if you want to know the essence of a human, it's not necessarily found in just an idealistic approach, but now Aristotle has provided another category for understanding, a more realistic category, something about the subject in and of itself. This focus on the subject also impacts how the Greek culture organized their government. The development of democracies in Athens especially reflects this emphasis on the person. Now this makes sense in an Aristotelian framework, but even in a Platonic framework, Plato had a lot to say about who we are as people and what constitutes the self. There's a lot of philosophy we're not going to get a chance to cover in a course like this. But notice how the Greeks portrayed their cultural values through history, how the Greeks portrayed their cultural values in their art, how Greeks portrayed their cultural values in their politics is all a reflection of how they thought about the world around them. Philosophy is not some disconnected speculation. Philosophy is the foundation for how we live our lives, how we organize our society, how we portray beauty, so on and so forth. Hopefully we get to talk about the same theme over and over and over again, because that is kind of the subtext to this entire course. In our next section, we will look at Hellenistic Greece. Greece being exported to the rest of the Mediterranean and beyond, and how that changed how Greeks ordered their lives, especially Alexander the Great, a disciple of Aristotle. Hey, I appreciate your time. Thank you.